Welcome back to The Explainer. All right, so today we're tackling a really chilling paradox that has completely flipped our understanding of modern global security. You know, when we think of violent terrorist groups, we usually picture them operating in the shadows, right? Constantly on the run, chaotic. But what happens when that whole dynamic completely flips? What happens when these groups stop hiding, violently seize territory, and then meticulously build highly structured, state-like administrations?
It's a question that totally upends everything we thought we knew about warfare and geopolitics. We're talking about groups like ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Boko Haram in Nigeria. These aren't just your standard rebel bands. They're highly organized entities that actively supplanted existing governments to rule over massive captive populations. So how on earth did they actually govern? How did they fund the whole shebang? And how did they manage to mimic the mundane mechanics of a legitimate state while simultaneously committing horrific atrocities? Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. First, we'll define the terror non-state. Second, we'll look at state-making as organized crime. Third, brutality meets bureaucracy. Fourth, how these illicit states fund themselves. And finally, the massive international law dilemma they create.
All right, jumping right into Section 1, defining the non-state. As a brand new legal category, we really need to pin down exactly what kind of entity we're dealing with here through the lens of international law. If we look at Darren E. Johnson's analysis from the Brooklyn Law Review, a terror non-state is a very specific, very dangerous phenomenon. It's an entity that essentially wrests control of territory by sheer force to govern a captive population. And in doing so, they completely subvert the rule of law and human rights. But here's the absolute kicker, the main differentiator. Unlike historical revolutionary groups you might be familiar with, these guys have zero interest in seeking global legitimacy. They don't want a seat at the UN. They actively, violently flout it. What's really interesting here is this stark contrast. Think about a traditional non-state actor, like historically Al-Qaeda. They mainly wanted safe havens, right? Undergoverned spaces where they could just hide out, plan, and train. Actually running a government was seen as a super distant, maybe eventual goal. But a terror non-state like ISIS or Boko Haram, they immediately seize physical territory from sovereign nations. They don't just want a hiding spot. They literally want to replace the state entirely and assert absolute brutal authority. Which brings us to Section 2, state-making as crime, and specifically the mafia analogy. This really helps explain the theoretical foundations of how they extract power and wealth. There's this incredibly powerful concept from parapolitics, brilliantly summed up by historian Charles Tilly. He wrote, "If protection rackets represent organized crime at its smoothest, then war-making and state-making, quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy, qualify as our largest examples of organized crime." It's wild to think about, but Tilly is basically comparing the very roots of state-building to mafia extortion. And man, is that framework useful for analyzing terror non-states. The sources actually draw a direct line between Tilly's theory and how criminal structures operate in a parallel symbiosis with the state. Just think of the mafia. They demand payments essentially as subscriptions for safety, right? You pay up, you're protected. You don't? Well, you face a very convincing threat of violence. They rely on tight bonds of trust within their own ranks, and they operate a strict territorial protection racket. Terror non-states basically take this exact mafia model and scale it up to a massive regional level just to extract wealth from a newly captive population. So how do they actually manage all that? Let's look at Section 3, brutal bureaucracy. The crucial point here is how they turn those theoretical mafia tactics into highly structured reality. And this brilliantly illustrates what we're talking about. Internal ISIS documents reveal just a staggering level of bureaucracy. This wasn't just a random band of fighters out in the desert. It was a wildly complex system featuring 14 distinct bureaus, or dawawin, that covered everything from health and education to agriculture and public services. They were meticulously replicating the functions of a modern state to manage the day-to-day lives of literally millions of people. Let's zoom in a bit on one specific and honestly terrifying department, the Bureau of Justice and Grievances. Now, historically speaking, in a 7th century Islamic context, a grievance bureau was basically just an administrative complaints office. Pretty standard stuff. But ISIS, they radically expanded its power. They resurrected the name but transformed it into an instrument of absolute total control over citizens in places like Raqqa and Aleppo.
Just look at the jurisdiction this bureau claimed. I mean, they had administrative oversight, sure, but also vast civil and criminal jurisdiction. They enforced incredibly strict Sharia and hudud crimes, meaning these were the actual guys ordering horrific punishments like amputations and stonings. But, and here's where it gets crazy, at the exact same time, they were regulating totally mundane daily life. They issued standardized bureaucratic forms to control real estate rent, satellite TV usage, even fixing the price of bread. It's this surreal, jarring contrast between ordinary civic administration and absolute, unspeakable brutality.
Moving into Section 4, funding illicit states. You really have to ask, how does a massive, brutal, bureaucratic machine like that actually pay for itself? Well, unlike a lot of traditional terrorist groups that rely pretty heavily on outside donors, terror non-states are defined by internally generated funding. They institute this elaborate internal taxation system on everything: fuel, vehicles, agriculture, you name it. They systematically confiscate property from minority groups. They literally charge school fees and taxes on cash withdrawals. And, tying right back to our mafia point earlier, they use heavy extortion, ransoms, and even brutal slave raids, like we saw with Boko Haram kidnapping the Chibok schoolgirls. They basically squeeze every single drop of resource from the territory they control. To really wrap your head around the scale of this extortion, let's look at this number: 20,000. At its peak, around 2014, Boko Haram controlled roughly 20,000 square miles of territory in northeastern Nigeria. To put that into perspective, that's an area about the size of the entire country of Belgium. Across that vast space, they violently taxed and subjugated a captive population of over 1.7 million people. It's just staggering. Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into the international law dilemma, because all of this creates an absolute legal nightmare for the global community. So the gold standard for defining a state in international law is the Montevideo Convention, which lists 4 specific criteria. Let's just walk through exactly why a terror non-state completely fails this test, even though they function a lot like a government. First, define territory? No, their borders are constantly shifting based on whatever battle happened yesterday. Permanent population? Definitely not. Their subjects are impermanent and held there by force. A government? Well, they claim to be one, but they have zero consent from the governed. And finally, diplomatic relations? Yeah, instead of diplomacy, they launch global terror campaigns and reject any global legitimacy. So, legally speaking, they are not states. But here's the really insidious part. By violently supplanting the actual state, they strip citizens of access to their sovereign rights and institutions. And that creates a massive, terrifying legal vacuum. It's in this dark, unrecognized gray area that their severe human rights abuses, the executions, the slavery, the mass displacement, are just allowed to thrive unchecked by the traditional norms that bind recognized nations. They exploit this loophole in international law to the absolute maximum to subjugate vulnerable people. Which ultimately leaves us with a really profound challenge. As military forces go in and recapture this territory, we are left staring at the bureaucratic architects of these atrocities. Not just the foot soldiers, but the judges who fixed the price of bread in the morning and ordered stonings in the afternoon, the administrators who meticulously collected the taxes. So how can our frameworks of international criminal law evolve to properly hold the creators of a terror non-state accountable? It's a heavy question, but finding the answer is absolutely crucial for the future of global justice. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I'll see you next time.